The 2026 FIFA World Cup is almost here, and this time it is bigger than ever. 48 teams, 3 host nations, 16 cities, and a price tag that runs into the billions. The United States, Canada, and Mexico are gearing up to host the most ambitious tournament in football history. The hype is enormous. The promises are even bigger. Economic transformation, tourism booms, a legacy that will last for generations. But before we get swept up in the excitement, there is a story worth telling. A story that has played out over and over again, in Brazil, in Russia, in South Africa, in Qatar. A story about what really happens when a country hosts the World Cup. Because the promise is always the same, and the reality is almost always something different. Billions of dollars spent, stadiums built, cameras pointed at your country for one glorious month. And then, the morning after, the empty venues, the missing tourists, the debt that somehow nobody fully accounted for. This is the real story of what it costs to host the World Cup, who benefits, who pays, and with 2026 right around the corner, whether this time finally someone has figured out how to do it right. To understand the problem, you need to understand the sales pitch. When FIFA, the governing body of world football, begins the process of selecting a host nation, it paints a picture that is very hard to resist. Billions of dollars in tourism revenue, hundreds of thousands of jobs created, infrastructure that will serve the country for decades, and, most powerfully, the eyes of the entire world, for 1 month, pointed directly at you. For any government, that is an intoxicating offer. Because a World Cup is not just a sporting event, it is a global advertisement. It is a statement that your country has arrived, that you are capable, modern, and open for business. For developing nations especially, the appeal goes even deeper. Here is a chance to leapfrog decades of slow development, to build stadiums, airports, highways, and hotels in a compressed timeline that would normally take a generation, all justified by the tournament. FIFA reinforces all of this. Their official reports ahead of every tournament project massive economic returns. They talk about GDP growth, job creation, and the long-term legacy of the infrastructure investment. It sounds like a deal too good to pass up. But here is what FIFA does not tell you. They do not pay for any of it. The host country pays. Every stadium, every road, every upgraded airport terminal, the bill goes to the host nation's government. FIFA collects the television rights money, the sponsorship money, and the ticketing revenue. In 2022, FIFA made over $7 billion from the Qatar World Cup alone. The host country gets the costs, FIFA gets the profits, and the costs are almost always, without exception, far higher than anyone predicted at the start. Let us look at the actual numbers, because the gap between what countries expected to spend and what they actually spent is jaw-dropping. South Africa hosted the 2010 World Cup, the first ever held on African soil. Before bidding, the government estimated costs of around $1 billion. The final bill came closer to $4 billion. The country built and renovated 10 stadiums. Several of them, including the famous Cape Town Stadium, now cost millions of dollars a year just to maintain, and are rarely used for anything significant. Brazil built and renovated 12 stadiums, including one in Manaus, deep in the Amazon rainforest, in a city with no professional football team that could fill it. One stadium, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars, has since been used as a storage facility and a makeshift COVID ward. Today, it sits largely empty. Russia in 2018. Estimated cost, around $10 billion. Actual cost, $14 billion. Several of the venues built in smaller Russian cities have struggled to attract events since the tournament ended. And then there is Qatar in 2022, the most expensive World Cup in history, by a very, very wide margin. Qatar spent an estimated $220 billion in total infrastructure spending connected to the tournament, a figure so large it almost does not feel real. To put it in perspective, that is more than all previous World Cups combined, multiplied several times over. Now, much of that spending was on broader infrastructure Qatar wanted anyway, but the scale is staggering. The pattern is consistent across every single host nation. The budget balloons, the costs overshoot, and when the tournament ends, the question of what to do with everything that was built remains largely unanswered. There is a term that economists use for expensive assets that cost more to maintain than they generate in value. They call them white elephants, and the World Cup produces white elephants at an almost industrial scale. The problem is structural. A World Cup requires 8 to 12 large stadiums, all of them needing to be ready at the same time, all of them needing to meet FIFA's strict capacity and quality requirements. For big footballing nations with existing infrastructure, this is manageable. For smaller or developing nations, it often means building brand new venues in cities that simply do not have the population or the sporting culture to fill them after the tournament. Manaus is the most cited example, but it is not alone. In South Africa, the stadium in Soweto had its capacity expanded significantly for 2010. The city's football league has since struggled to attract regular crowds. The maintenance bill runs every year regardless. In Brazil, the Arena Amazonia was not the only problem stadium. The Arena das Dunas in Natal, the Estádio Nacional in Brasília, these venues were built in cities where football was not the dominant sport and where the local economy could not support a major league team capable of filling them regularly. This is what economists call the post-event utilization problem. You build for peak demand, 60,000 fans attending a World Cup quarterfinal, but peak demand only happens once. After that, you are left managing a giant building designed for an event that will never happen there again. And maintaining a large modern stadium is not cheap. Security, cleaning, staffing, structural upkeep, it runs into millions of dollars every year. Money that, for many host nations, comes directly from public budgets, from taxpayers who may never set foot inside. The white elephant does not disappear after the closing ceremony, it just gets more expensive. One of the most powerful arguments for hosting the World Cup is the tourism boom. Hundreds of thousands of football fans descending on your country, spending money on hotels, restaurants, transport, and souvenirs. It sounds like an economic windfall. The reality is more complicated. Yes, World Cup tourists come, and yes, they spend money. But economists who have studied the data carefully have found that the net tourism effect is almost always smaller than expected, and sometimes even negative. Here is why. When a country is hosting the World Cup, regular tourists stay away. Prices spike. Cities get crowded and chaotic. Business travelers reschedule their trips. Conferences get moved. Hotels that would normally serve a mix of visitors are entirely consumed by football fans, often at negotiated FIFA rates that are lower than peak commercial rates. So what you get is a substitution effect. Football tourists replace regular tourists. They do not simply add on top. And World Cup tourists, it turns out, are not high spenders. Many of them travel on tight budgets, buy tickets months in advance at FIFA-controlled prices, and spend most of their time in fan zones and stadiums, not in local restaurants and shops. South Africa expected 373,000 foreign visitors for the 2010 tournament. Around 310,000 actually came, and several studies found that the country's overall tourism revenue for that year was not significantly higher than in previous years. Brazil found similar results. The promised tourism legacy largely did not materialize in the years following 2014. The tourism boom is real. It is just not big enough, not remotely big enough, to justify the scale of the investment made to host the tournament. The economic disappointment is one thing, but there is a human cost to this story that often goes underreported. In Brazil, the preparations for the 2014 World Cup triggered some of the largest protests the country had seen in a generation. Hundreds of thousands of Brazilians took to the streets in 2013, in what became known as the Vinegar Revolt. The demonstrations started over a bus fare increase, but rapidly became something much bigger. People were furious that their government was spending billions of dollars on football stadiums while hospitals were crumbling, schools were underfunded, and public transport was falling apart. The protests were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. Images of Brazilian police clashing with their own citizens in a country preparing to host the world's biggest party went around the globe. One protester's sign became famous. It read, "FIFA Standard Hospitals." In Qatar, the human cost took a different form. The construction of World Cup infrastructure relied heavily on migrant workers from Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries, working under the kafala system, a form of labor arrangement that critics have long described as exploitative. Workers had their passports confiscated. They could not change jobs or leave the country without their employer's permission, in extreme heat, in dangerous conditions. The Guardian newspaper investigated and reported that hundreds of migrant workers may have died during the years of construction. Qatar disputed the figures, but the conditions were documented and widely condemned. The World Cup brings the world together, as the slogan always says, but the people who build it are rarely invited to the party. To be fair, the picture is not entirely bleak. There are cases where hosting the World Cup has delivered genuine, lasting benefits. South Korea and Japan in 2002 are often cited as the most successful co-hosted tournament in history. Both countries used the event to accelerate infrastructure development they genuinely needed. Japan's high-speed rail connections between host cities were improved. South Korea upgraded its airports and hospitality sector in ways that benefited the country for years afterwards. And both nations received enormous boosts to their international image, particularly South Korea, which was still in the process of positioning itself as a modern, globally connected economy. Germany in 2006 is another example. The tournament, famously nicknamed the Summer Fairy Tale, produced an outpouring of national pride and a genuinely warm international reception for a country that had long been cautious about public displays of patriotism. The economic return was modest, but the soft power effect, the reshaping of Germany's image in the eyes of the world, was significant and lasting. The lesson from these examples is consistent. The countries that benefit most from hosting the World Cup are those that already have the infrastructure in place, keep their additional spending modest and targeted, and use the tournament to showcase something real, not to construct a fantasy version of themselves for a global audience. The World Cup works best as a spotlight. It works very badly as a construction project. So, if the economics are so questionable, why do countries keep bidding? The answer is mostly political, and a little bit psychological. For a national leader, hosting the World Cup is one of the most powerful statements you can make. It is visible. It is exciting. It generates genuine national pride. And the benefits, the opening ceremony, the packed stadiums, the global coverage, happen while you are in office. The costs and the empty stadiums come later, often under someone else's watch. There is also an element of prestige that operates outside of economic logic. For many nations, particularly developing ones, being selected to host the World Cup is validation. It is the international community saying, you are significant, you belong at the top table. That feeling is genuinely valuable, even if it is hard to put a number on it. And FIFA, it must be said, is a masterful sales force. The bidding process is competitive, emotionally charged, and structured in a way that encourages countries to outbid each other with increasingly lavish promises. The race to win the bid often sets the stage for the overspending that follows. The result is a system where the incentives are almost perfectly designed to produce bad outcomes. Countries overspend chasing prestige. FIFA profits regardless of what happens after, and the bill is paid by ordinary taxpayers who had little say in the decision. The World Cup is, genuinely, a magical event. The football is extraordinary. The sense of global togetherness, for 1 month every 4 years, is real and powerful and worth something. But the magic comes at a price, and that price is paid overwhelmingly by the host nation's public, while the profits flow upward to FIFA, to sponsors, and to the construction companies that build the stadiums. And this conversation could not be more timely, because the 2026 World Cup is almost here. For the first time in history, 3 countries are co-hosting together: the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It is also the first tournament to feature 48 teams instead of 32, meaning more matches, more venues, and inevitably, more spending. The United States alone is hosting matches across 11 cities, from New York to Los Angeles, Dallas to Seattle. Most of the venues are existing NFL stadiums, which is genuinely smart planning. Unlike Brazil or Qatar, America is not building expensive new structures from scratch in cities that don't need them. The infrastructure largely already exists. That alone puts this tournament in a different category from many of its predecessors. Mexico is returning to World Cup hosting for a 3rd time, having hosted in 1970 and 1986, with matches spread across 3 cities, including Mexico City's iconic Estadio Azteca, which will become the first stadium in history to host World Cup matches 3 times. Canada is hosting its first ever World Cup matches, with games in Toronto and Vancouver, cities with strong sporting cultures and modern stadiums already in place. On paper, this is exactly the kind of hosting model that economists would recommend. Existing infrastructure. Shared costs across 3 nations. No need to build cities from nothing in the desert. Whether 2026 will finally be the World Cup that proves hosting can be done responsibly and profitably, or whether it will follow the familiar pattern of ballooning budgets and broken promises, we are about to find out. The question is not whether you can host the World Cup. The question is whether you can afford the morning after. If you found this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover the stories behind the biggest events in global economics and politics. And let me know in the comments, do you think the 2026 format, spread across 3 countries, is finally the smarter way to do this? Or is it just a bigger version of the same old problem?